Welcome to Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo, keeping you connected to your faith and your world. Teresa tackles the issues of faith and culture, the pro-life message, and media awareness. And now, here's Teresa Tomeo.
And it's a Thursday. It's July 24th, 2025. Thank you for tuning in to the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Great to be with you as we're sailing through the beautiful season of summer. Hope it's going well for you. We're so glad that you're tuned in. We have a great lineup today, thanks to our wonderful crack team in Irondale. We have our very own Father Mitch Pacwa, who is back with us for our cultural connections. Now, there's so many stories out there that are so compelling, and I love the fact that Father Mitch always gives us a beautiful perspective through the lens of Catholic teaching and the fullness of our truth. Richard and I, my producer Richard Jesse and I, were discussing this heartbreaking story yesterday. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see the impact statements that were given in Idaho at the sentencing of the murderer of those college students back in 2022. The pain, the heartache, the gut-wrenching emotion that was expressed. And he was sentenced to 4 life sentences, no chance for parole. That was in exchange for not getting the death penalty. There's a lot of discussion when these cases come up, when these horrific murder cases come up in states that have the death penalty. Would that be the answer? And I want to take a look at Catholic teaching on this. Now, you can't even imagine, unless someone has been through something like this, the pain. I mean, I've interviewed so many family members of murder victims, and it's just, I mean, horrific to hear what they have to say in terms of what they're struggling with, what they're struggling. But the Church's wisdom in this, in terms of giving everyone a chance to basically come around and have a contrite heart. Now, is this possible? Only God knows. Because watching that man in the courtroom yesterday, he was just stone cold. He barely moved. He flinched maybe once or twice, but you could see death in his eyes. I mean, it was very eerie. But what does our faith say about this? And why does a church say that we always have to give someone a chance, but also in terms of justice? Where does justice come in? You know, John Paul II, and those of us old enough to remember when he was shot in St. Peter's Square, remember also that he went to see the gunman in jail, and he forgave him, Aliaja. But that gunman remained behind bars. He didn't walk out of the jail hand in hand with John Paul II. So the Church is not saying no justice. But John Paul II has a beautiful quote: "Forgiveness is not the opposite of justice." So how do we deal with this? Because I can't even imagine, I don't think any of us can, what the families are still going through 3 years later. So we'll discuss with the amazing Father Mitch Pacwa. Another amazing priest, Father Tad Pacholczyk from the National Catholic Bioethics Center, joining us this morning. My goodness, we need like 5 hours today. There's so many topics about which we could discuss with Father Tad, including this story about organ donations. Now, there's going to be a whole revamping of the system through the Trump administration because of what was recently learned. And Catholic News Agency, by the way, has an excellent story on this today at catholicnewsagency.com, that in several cases in Kentucky, organs are removed from people who were not yet dead. So this whole idea of the lack of dignity for the human person and the lack of respect for the human body, this culture of death, and a lot of it traces back to money. And then we also look at the issue of euthanasia, which really is the same thing. And what's happening in Canada is chilling. So much to discuss with Father Tad Pacholczyk. I do hope you can stay tuned for the first hour. And also the second hour, we're going to take a look at a number of media issues with Tim Graham from Newsbusters and, of course, Media Research Center. But more on that a little bit later on. Let's give you a look on the weather. We have extreme heat, according to the National Weather Service, and dangerous, long-lasting heat, they're calling it, remaining across the Mid-South to the Mid-Mississippi Valley while heat expands into the Northeast for a brief period tomorrow. Now, strong to isolated severe thunderstorms and heavy rain pose some flash flooding threats from the southern high plains east to the Great Lakes. So that is going to be a little bit of a difficult situation the next couple of days. And as you recall, the Weather Center is also saying that we could see the heat all the way through the end of July, which would be all the way through next week. Right now, though, it's already 4 minutes past the hour. A ton of news to get through on a Thursday, July 24th. Thank you for listening to Catholic Connection, an EWTN production. Let's check the news right now on EWTN. Well, as we mentioned earlier, impact statements read at the sentencing of the man who admitted to killing of 4 University of Idaho college students back in 2022. Surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen was among those speaking in court.
What happened that night changed everything. Because of him, 4 beautiful, genuine, compassionate people were taken from this world.
Brian Kohberger heard from family members and friends of the victims, but was not required to tell the court his motive for the killings. Prosecutors say they cannot force him to explain why he did it because that's not part of the plea deal. The former PhD student sentenced, as we mentioned earlier, to 4 consecutive life sentences with no ability for parole. Meanwhile, the judge in the case, Judge Stephen Hippler, said that legally he, too, was not able to ask Kohberger why he committed the murders, and he also says it's really not worth it.
By continuing to focus on why, we continue to give Mr. Kohberger relevance. We give him agency and we give him power.
Hippler saying there will be no way to know whether he was telling the truth. He also says, according to the judge, he hopes no one works with Kohberger to write a book, a movie script, or give him any more publicity. Again, Kohberger admitting to the 2022 murders in a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. And we'll talk more about this with Father Mitch Pacwa coming up after the news and our break. The director of national intelligence saying there are more documents showing Obama's White House led the effort to manufacture intelligence that Russia interfered in the election back in 2016. Tulsi Gabbard has already passed along her ongoing investigation into the Department of Justice for a criminal referral, but yesterday adding she's unearthed more troubling evidence surrounding that election.
Led by President Obama, there was an effort to create a document that would serve as a foundation for what would be a years-long coup against President Trump.
On Tuesday, President Trump backing Tulsi Gabbard, saying the intelligence community caught Obama cold. The Biden White House chief of staff is set to testify today in the GOP probe of the former president's mental fitness in office. Ron Klein previously agreed to do a closed-door interview, but it's unknown if he will plead the fifth and not answer questions. The probe has been focused on Biden's mental decline and use of an auto pen. Authorities fear there are no survivors after a Soviet-era passenger plane carrying 49 people, including 5 children, crashed at the base of a mountain in Far East Russia near the border with China yesterday. Daria Bondarchuk reports.
The crew error or a possible technical malfunction of the jet are considered as probable causes of the plane crash. Rescue operation is underway but is complicated because the debris is scattered across a densely wooded area.
The regional governor says the plane operated by Angara Airlines disappearing from radar as it was preparing to land. Crews are sent to the scene after the wreckage was spotted from a helicopter. Reports say the plane was built back in 1976 and was previously flown by the Soviet airline Aeroflot before the collapse of the Soviet Union. 3 Ohio police officers wounded yesterday afternoon in what officials are calling an ambush. 2 were sitting in their patrol car eating lunch when they were shot with a high-powered rifle.
He was laying in wait and opened fire with multiple rounds at both of the officers who were sitting in their vehicles.
That's Acting Police Chief Michael Failing. The shooting happening in Lorain, about 30 miles west of Cleveland. 2 officers shot multiple times and airlifted to a hospital. The third treated for a gunshot wound to the hand. Police say later the suspect was killed when officers filed back. Mark Mayfield tells us a man accused of throwing concrete blocks at federal agents in Paramount, California, is behind bars after more than a month on the run.
The FBI arrested Compton resident Elpidio Reyna on Wednesday morning at the U.S.-Mexico border. Investigators say he threw concrete blocks at passing ICE and Border Patrol vehicles on June the 7th, when federal immigration raids were beginning to ramp up in Los Angeles County. Several vehicles were damaged and 1 federal officer was injured. Reyna was taken back to Los Angeles to face criminal proceedings. I'm Mark Mayfield.
A Long Island man facing federal charges for allegedly placing homemade bombs on a Manhattan rooftop and on subway tracks. 55-year-old Michael Gann is accused of building the IEDs with materials he bought online and then storing them on a residential rooftop in Soho, where this woman, Christine Arrochio, lives.
In the course of 6 months, I saw him like 10 times on the roof.
Residents called police because they thought someone was living on the rooftop. Another bomb was dropped onto the tracks of the Williamsburg Bridge. None of the bombs went off. Authorities say they had 600 times the force of commercial fireworks. He was arrested back in early June. Daniel Martindale tells us the Archdiocese of Los Angeles is now launching a new program to help families impacted by ICE raids.
On Wednesday, Archbishop Jose Gomez announced the Family Assistance Program. It will help Archdiocese parishes provide meals, groceries, and prescription deliveries to families impacted by ICE operations. Immigration advocates say people are afraid to leave their homes and now need essential items delivered. I'm Daniel Martindale.
Pope Leo XIV returning to the Vatican on July 22nd around 9 p.m. local time earlier this week, spending more than 2 weeks at the papal residence in Castel Gandolfo. Catholic News Agency tells us a Holy See press office officially confirming the news. The pontiff spending a period of rest, July 6th through the 22nd, in the Italian town about 15 miles just south of Rome on the shores of Lake Albano. In addition to resting, the Holy Father also fulfilled several apostolic commitments. One of the most significant, the meeting held on July 9th, a private meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who made a special trip to the town to meet with the Pope. Columbia University agreeing to pay a $200 million fine over the next 3 years to resolve allegations in the Trump administration that it discriminated against Jewish students. The move will restore hundreds of millions of dollars in federal grants. Acting Columbia President Claire Shipman saying in a release the agreement marks an important step forward after a period of sustained federal scrutiny and institutional uncertainty. The statement went on to say that while Columbia is not admitting to any wrongdoing, the institution's leadership has recognized Jewish students and faculty have experienced painful, unacceptable incidents. Columbia will also pledge to follow laws banning the consideration of race in admissions and hiring. Catholic News Agency also reporting this morning the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee will formally now prohibit men from competing in women's sports amid the Trump administration's efforts to roll back transgender policies throughout the U.S. The committee saying in an email to Olympic groups and stakeholders earlier this week that leaders had engaged in a series of respectful and constructive conversations with federal leaders after the president's February executive order that moved to protect opportunities for women and girls to compete in safe and fair sports. Under the Trump administration, they say we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls. Trump said when signing the order from now on, women's sports will only be for women. And finally, in our news segment on a busy Thursday morning, July 24th, nearly 100 million people, we mentioned this briefly, or at least alluded to it in the weather forecast, in a large part of our country impacted by heat alerts as that heat dome brings temperatures into the 90s and even above.
This brutal heat dome bearing down on much of the country from the Midwest to the Northeast, even the South, some places expecting those temperatures to feel like 115 degrees.
That's reporter Shaquille Brewster explaining several cities, including Kansas City, Oklahoma City, and St. Louis, could see heat indexes of over 100 degrees. Tomorrow, the Great Lakes region will see areas that have a high heat index in the mid-90s, with the highest temperatures shifting more to the East Coast on Friday. 13 minutes past the hour. We appreciate your listenership here on EWTN, the one, the only Father Mitch Pacwa, and our Cultural Connections up next. Thanks for tuning in.
What happened that night changed everything. Because of him, four beautiful, genuine, compassionate people were taken from this world.
Ugh. That is the voice of Dylan Mortensen. We also ran that clip during the news, if you recall. It's a powerful audio clip because it shows her emotion and what she is going through. And she also described, if you watched any of the coverage yesterday of the impact statements in this case of Kohberger, she also described her life since the murder. She was one of the roommates. She was a roommate there, and she survived that horror. And she was talking about the fact that she's had to basically sleep with her parents. Okay? And she's had all kinds of emotional fallout, mental health fallout from that, as you can imagine, panic attacks. She says everywhere she goes, doesn't matter, she has an escape plan. She has problems waking up, breathing, where she just feels like she's suffocating. So the pain, the raw pain that was exhibited, and the courage it took to face the brutal murderer, Kohberger, it was just something very, very tough to watch. Father Mitch Pacwa joins us this morning on a Thursday. And Father, this is something to which you can relate, because you, I remember the story, you actually witnessed a murder. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Good morning.
Are you okay?
I guess hearing that, my friend was killed. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I'm so sorry, Father.
55 years ago.
55 years ago.
And that doesn't change.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It just, that's one of the things. I remember being at his wake and at the wake of other murder victims. And what I would have wanted was the guys who did the killing to be behind glass, one of those two-way mirrors, and watch the effect. There's one of the problems I think that we've had with so many police shows of murder and stuff, and the characters come back. They're in another show.
Yep.
And you don't take it seriously.
Right. Father, that's something I actually mentioned in my book, Noise, the research on that, because also not only the TV shows, but the newscast, because they will show someone being arraigned and that person ends up being like a hero because they, God forbid, shot a cop, and in certain areas that may be considered, something, but they don't show what happens to him because the media don't follow up with the court case unless it's a really dramatic story like this one, follow it to its fruition in terms of the actual adjudication of the case. And so people think that, somebody else was shot, somebody else dies, okay, fine, it's sad, but they don't understand the long-term fallout because they don't see the consequences.
And what you want, what I wanted to see was not the killing of the guy. That doesn't accomplish anything. But what typically is the case is that these are psychopaths. Or sociopaths. They are completely incapable, or in varying degrees. There are degrees of this problem. There are varying degrees of a capacity to identify with other people at all. That I would admit they were probably not loved. Growing up, I readily would recognize that. And they remain incapable of understanding the effect of suffering in anybody else. These are folks whose world centers on them.
So, Father, what about this whole idea? And I want to discuss this because this is so important. John Paul II, I forget which document it was in. He said, "Forgiveness is not the opposite of justice. We are called to forgive, but in this case, you can understand that it's a process. Okay, I mean, what those families went through, what you went through, 55 years later, you're still brought to tears, bless your heart, because of your friend losing his life at the hand of a murderer." So as Catholics, when we hear this and we hear your voice and we see those people just completely broken, how do we explain to people that, answering death with death is not the best thing for anybody? Because even if, let's say, someone supported the death penalty. It was a very interesting discussion. I was watching the coverage yesterday. There was a defense attorney who would say these people would never see this man executed because of the legal system. And it will cost taxpayers and so many people gazillions of dollars to and this person being on death row. We see it all the time. So how do we explain that, though, from a Catholic perspective, do you think?
Yeah, there are a couple things. I think, number one, society must be protected from people like this who, they're sociopaths and psychopathic types. They in society, they cannot remain in society. They have to be removed from the free world and put in a place where they who have no interior capacity for self-discipline can find the discipline of 4 small walls that keeps them from harming other people, including keeps them from harming other people in prison. Knowing, I've gone into the prisons lots of times, and I love the inmates. I don't think they should be out because they can't handle the free world for the most part. And a lot of folks who say, well, this is just a prison. You don't know what you're talking about when you meet these folks and how many of them are killers. And you have to distinguish the ones who have killed from the ones who remain and still pose a danger to the other inmates. You have to protect people from such types and hopefully reach something within them that still remains of the conscience God created and the perhaps the ability to love. Most of them, just like that movie, The Birdman of Alcatraz, he had to begin with birds. Mm-hmm. Just having an affection for somebody outside of himself is a major step forward. And these folks didn't have pets. They didn't have a family that loved them. I understand all that, and they can't do it. So society must be protected. Now, the question is, in terms of executing them. That's I don't recommend any argument saying, well, that doesn't prevent other people from doing it. That's right. In many societies, the death penalty does not prevent others from committing the crime, but it does prevent that person from doing it. What the risks, there are risks with the death penalty. One is that more than one innocent person has been put to death, and when their innocence is discovered, you can't take it back.
Father, hang on. We have to take a break.
Sure.
Let's pick this up after, and thank you for sharing your heart with us this morning, and we're sorry for your loss and for having the courage as a wonderful priest to share your heart. We'll be right back. More with Father Mitch Pacwa. Stay tuned.
By continuing to focus on why, we continue to give Mr. Kohberger relevance. We give him agency and we give him power.
That's Judge Stephen Hippler in Idaho yesterday at the sentencing of Kohberger, who brutally murdered 4 college students back in 2022. He was sentenced yesterday to 4 consecutive life terms and no ability for parole or to appeal his case. And if any of you watch the coverage, and I don't know about you, Father, but when I was watching it, I had to walk away from it because it was just so raw and the pain.
Yes.
And the lives shattered. I can't even, what it's like because you saw a murder, you saw your friend being killed, but It's just horrific. And I can remember it took me back to my days as a street reporter where I covered so many murder cases and interviewed so many family members of the murder victims. So you were talking about, you had 2 points you wanted to make. You made the first one. Continue with your thought. Then I want to dive a little bit more into the church teaching on the death penalty.
Yeah, there are a couple of things. I would first of all point out that you can't really get revenge. I don't know that you'll find peace of mind by having the person executed. That's not going to happen. And as a matter of fact, as you can tell from today, 55 years later doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to figure out something better for what it is you are looking for. Are you looking for revenge? Won't happen. And satisfaction cannot happen from this. It just can't. So what we have to then look to, especially as Christians, is what is it we want? This is a problem that a lot of people don't really know what they want. They have oftentimes a better idea of what they don't want than what they do want. And this is highly problematic. You can't you can't go by what you don't want. Mm-hmm. You want this person to suffer. Okay, what does that get you? What is the goal of that? None of that is going to work, and it won't bring an end for that poor girl's nightmares. I remember I had nightmares every night for a year and a half.
Mm.
After seeing my friend killed. And that just is not going to go away, automatically. This is something that very much has to be addressed in other ways, other formats. And I think to keep in mind that, this is what, we want to have positively accomplished. Now, it's there's I understand. I had another a relative of mine, a young girl, 16, raped and murdered, and I wanted to kill the guy. In fact, I would have been happy to hear the confession, and then I would have pushed any button they had.
Wow.
But to actually, and this is truly the feeling. It would be like flushing a toilet. That's how it felt. I had to work. That was my first human reaction. And you have to work through that.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It's not easy, but to come to a point of Christian, and I had folks who, I knew a number of folks who were anti-death penalty and all this stuff, and they were saying, "Oh, well, we'll help bring you around." And that would infuriate me that they would be acting like that, to have this sense of, they're going to get me to work this out. That was outrageous because they had no comprehension
of what it
how
felt like.
Bad the pain is.
So then where do they go, these poor people and these family members? I mean, you're describing very raw emotions, decades later. Obviously, faith comes into it. You can't, I don't know how anybody does anything without God. But at the same time, I think, what the judge said, there was another clip that we ran, I think we're talking about or maybe I just saw it on TV. He needs to be, as you said, separated. The thing, though, that's in this day and age, Father, with this mass media attention on the gross and evil, one of the commentators yesterday brought out the fact that he's probably going to get a documentary. He'll probably write a book. Now, any proceeds, I heard that say, if he tries to sell a book, is going to go back to the victims' families. But still, they want to stay in the spotlight. And I don't know what kind of a deal was struck if he has the ability to do that, for somebody to come in with the camera crew into the prison, God forbid, and do an interview, because he wants to keep that out there. He's dying for attention. That's one of they had a psychologist saying that's one of the aspects of that.
That's part of the egomania.
Right.
The self-centeredness. I remember back in the 80s that developing positive self-image was one of the big goals of school education, because they couldn't teach the 10 Commandments. So they thought if they taught positive self-imaging, that would be enough to make people moral. Because if you have a positive self-image, you can make other people feel positive.
Yeah, how's that working out for us? Father, we have about 2 minutes left.
I was just going to say that the people who had the highest self-image were the psychopaths.
Right. Narcissist.
Yeah.
So what would you say to those of us who, and you still struggle with it, from a Catholic perspective, in terms of when we see these stories? We know what the church teaches about the death penalty. How do we work through this and help other people see why the church teaches what she teaches?
Well, this is where it has to be that focus on Jesus Christ, our Lord. That focus on Him, forgiving the thief, forgiving the people that were trying to kill him, as he hung on the cross, and that prayer, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. I need to remember that. All of us need to have a clear sense of it. And does it all of a sudden go away? Absolutely not. It is something that becomes catastrophic. There is no doubt of that. But it is still something that you can say, all right, I'm going to do the best I can to work on that. And it will not mean that the pain won't go away. The pain, it doesn't. It doesn't. The emptiness in your heart remains. Mm. And that's just what PTSD is about. Nobody called it that back in the day, but I had the same problem with heart palpitations and everything else that other people, that young girl was talking about.
Father, we have to talk more about this. Unfortunately, out of time. Thank you so much for your sharing this morning. Really appreciate the raw honesty and from the heart of Father Mitch Pacwa. He's an amazing priest. He's a tough man sometimes, but he also has a very big and a very soft heart. And this is real life, folks. And the church gives us the answers to everything, and we shouldn't be afraid at looking at it and dealing with our emotions, because our Lord knows everything that we've gone through and experienced it himself. But this is all wrapped up in this whole idea of this lack of respect for human life. And there are so many stories that reflect what's going on in our culture today. And we need to be aware of these. And we need to know what the church teaches. And everything is connected. Once you start killing your own people, as Mother Teresa said, how can you expect peace when you're killing the most vulnerable of all? And we see this play out in so many different ways, in so many secular stories. I would encourage you to go to CatholicNewsAgency.com, as I always do. But check out the story. They went into more detail about this story out of Kentucky. Did you hear about this? With organ donations, where they were actually taking organs from people. This sounds like something. Actually, there was a movie back in the 80s. We'll have to talk about that. I wonder if Father Tad remembers it, about a similar circumstance. It actually, I don't know, it's art imitating life. But they actually removed organs from people who were not dead. So, Father Tad, there's so many stories out there. I know I want to talk about the movement in Canada. That was the original region we brought you on. But this story regarding the whole situation in organ donation. It's another reflection of, hey, it's all about the money. We can do whatever we want with the body. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, glad to join you. Yeah, the money is certainly a piece. I think there's a lot of pressure these days to acquire organs. The organ procurement organizations really feel the pressure. And I think with time, and maybe due to a lack of vigilance and oversight, these agencies appear to be kind of cutting corners. And this is really a concern because, there's clearly a sense in which organ donation is a very generous act when somebody makes the decision that they want to be able to do it. And I think it's a shame when there's a degradation of public trust in the whole institution of organ transplantation, because it really is a life-giving step that people do when they make this decision and can extend someone else's life by years and even decades. So, I think it's really sad when we have our organ procurement organizations go off the rails, but I'm very glad to see that Health and Human Services has been digging into this and addressing the matter. I think it's incredibly important to bring back integrity to the entire enterprise.
Do we know how bad it is in terms of is this just an outlier, this situation, or has it happened more than we think? Usually where there's smoke, there's fire, as the old saying goes.
Yes, exactly. I think here we don't know the full extent of it. And I think there's been a temptation on the part of the organ procurement organizations to kind of engage in what we call self-regulation.
Oh,
and
we've heard that before.
Yeah, exactly. That's not a good way for us to do this at all. It has to be outside, independent review. And that's something that the HHS, the Health and Human Services, are pushing very clearly and strongly for. So, the extent of this, I think the investigations are going to, the fact that there is an investigation that's as public as this is going to immediately bring to the surface other instances. And I think that's a good thing. I remember talking with a physician friend of mine in Florida, and he is one of 3 physicians involved in declaring brain death and at his particular hospital. And he said, there's one of us 3 that when he declares somebody to be brain dead, the other 2 of us, we say to ourselves, well, we better double check. And that's not very reassuring, but it reminds us that there are lapses, and sometimes there may be just simply not a willingness to follow protocols. And I think our organ procurement organizations have slipped into this, at least in certain parts of the country. So I think a review like this is really important, and I'm so glad, that it is taking place, because I really would like to see a kind of restoration of a sense of decency and integrity around this. And I have to say I was also glad to see that the HHS announcement used the word sanctity when it was referring to the lives of people who have been violated, because that word sanctity, I don't recall seeing it very much under the Biden administration. And this is something that we need to kind of fall back to a foundational set of values that are well rooted.
Talking with Father Tad Pacholczyk. Check out his terrific website. Tons of information on all things Catholic, especially in the area of bioethics. FatherTad.com. The word father is spelled out. Father, in terms of the church teaching, what does the church tell us about organ donation?
Well, so organ donation is certainly permissible after an individual is properly declared to be deceased. So there's 2 ways that you can be declared to be deceased. One is the stopping of your heart and your lungs, so loss of cardiopulmonary function, and that has to reach a point of what we call irreversibility. In other words, the heart's not going to restart by itself, and your breathing's not going to kick back in again. That's really, the sort of obvious way, but there's another way that it's possible to determine that somebody has died, and that's to assess brain function, and if you have complete and irreversible loss of all functions of the brain, that individual also is deceased. And sometimes that can happen while you're on a ventilator, and then you've died, and basically you are a corpse being ventilated, and that can continue for, some amount of time, not super long, but that allows then for the obtaining of some of the organs if that individual had consented to be a donor before they died. So the church supports this as, a choice. The church does say that this requires explicit consent.
Yeah, but see, this is the thing. We've seen so many stories where the consent wasn't there, number one, and number two, how many stories, and you know this was your area of expertise, where people wake up after people thought they were dead.
Right. That's been part of what the HHS report was looking into. Some, they called them horror stories of that type. And those, gain a lot of traction if they get into the news. It makes people say to themselves, well, maybe I shouldn't, sign my driver's license here. And I think it's important to, not let one or two outliers kind of dampen the possibilities here. But at the same time, I think a very careful investigation by HHS will be helpful. And just on the consent thing, I think it's important to note also that what they do in Europe is something that's a concern and a problem. They use presumed consent. So if you die and you haven't said anything, they're able to take your organs. The church doesn't support that approach. The church requires that people say, yes, I want to be a donor, and, sign the dotted line or otherwise indicate it through their proxy, their healthcare proxy, who may be making decisions for them if they're unable to do so.
And by the way, I don't know if you remember this movie, but the movie came out in 1978 starring Michael Douglas and Genevieve Bujold. It was called Coma. It's a medical thriller. Douglas plays Dr. Mark Bellows, a surgeon whose girlfriend and fellow doctor Susan Wheeler, Genevieve Bujold, investigates a series of mysterious comas and deaths in their hospital. Her investigation leads her to uncover a sinister conspiracy involving the illegal harvesting and sale of organs from comatose patients. Now, I know that's Hollywood, and when you would see that movie, it seems so, creepy and far-fetched, but that movie immediately popped into my head. I even told my producer that this week when I was looking at this story, because this is frightening. This is like a horror film.
It is, and I do recall, I didn't see the movie, but I recall seeing there was a book of the same title.
Yeah.
And I even recall the cover on the book. It was a very kind of dramatic illustration of somebody suspended in midair. And, this idea of kind of utilizing people then as raw materials for obtaining organs. I think this is something that all of us, when we realize as we get older and more vulnerable, we're concerned that could happen indeed.
Yeah.
And so I think having a very, very clearly pro-life medical establishment is so important in that regard. And that's been part of the problem. The logic of pro-life indicates that if you're going to be willing, for example, to do abortions or to end the life of human embryos in clinics, then what's to say you shouldn't do it at other stages of human life?
Exactly. Exactly.
And Mother Teresa was so consistent about that and pointing out the logical consistency and the need to make sure we don't do it at any stage of human life.
Right. We only have about 4 minutes left. We need like 5 segments with you this morning, Father. But quickly, along those same lines, we see what's happening in Canada and this push now, and they're saying this could become part of their euthanasia laws by 2027 if you have a mental struggle, if you have a mental health issue. And the one pro-life parliamentary member that testified against this was talking about if you break up with your girlfriend or your boyfriend, you have a super bad day, you're struggling, you lost your job. What they're looking at is being able to allow people to literally walk into, I don't even want to call it a doctor's office because doctors are supposed to do no harm, but walk into a medical facility and get the medication needed to take their own life. And there was an interesting story that I sent you regarding an evangelical outlet looking at Christians in Canada, and so many of them don't know that this is going on. And it alluded to the fact that one of the problems, and this pertains again to following the money, is that because of their socialized medicine system, they are able to, I guess, get counseling services through the government, make appointments. But it's so backed up So immediately my mind went to, here we go again. It's a money thing. All these people on a waiting list, all this kind of money that they may spend waiting around, just kill yourself if you're depressed.
Yeah, this is true, and this is the situation in Canada. A lot of people have written about this, a lack of access, and some people have, sort of pushed it a little further and just said, well, is poverty itself driving Canadians to consider the use of this medical assistance in dying, as they call it? That sort of situation. And certainly Canadians who have disabilities are rising up really in the face of all of this and saying, look, this is so clearly devaluing who we are. Mm-hmm. And people are talking all the time about living their lives and not being a burden on others, and using that then as a kind of lever arm to say, well, people who are disabled, they should be thinking about doing this medical aid in dying, medical assistance in dying, and committing suicide, basically. And it's a terrible pressure that's being brought to bear here.
Yes, but that's what you said. It goes along those lines. You're going to get to that point, right?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, the mental illness thing is particularly terrible in my mind because it plays into a very real moment of vulnerability.
Yep.
And, the statistics show that, for example, people who have schizophrenia, they're already 8 times more likely than the general population to die by suicide. And if you have manic depression, it's 15 times higher. So you have a vulnerable population. You're offering them, pills here to end their own lives. It's so unfair. We need to be providing outstanding mental health treatments.
Yes, but that treatment costs money. So again, follow the money,
the
right?
dollars.
And also, then I guess we can get rid of suicide hotlines and all those kinds of programs because we don't need any more for telling people to kill themselves. Father, great. Yeah, exactly. Great discussion. Have to talk further about this. Thank you so much for joining us. Father Tad Pacholczyk, check out his great website, fathertad.com, and also his work through the National Catholic Bioethics Center, ncbcenter.org. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for tuning into Catholic Connection on a Thursday morning, July 24th. To say some prayers for Father Mitch and, of course, all the family members and friends of the victims of that horrible murder in Idaho that took place back in 2022. The sentencing yesterday, the murderer, and, of course, the impact statements. I was telling my producer during the break, Richard, that I had to walk away from listening to the testimony because it was just so raw. But don't be afraid to deal with these kinds of things because the Catholic Church, as I always say, and this is why we bring these up, gives us the beauty of the faith, the teachings, the truth on everything from womb to tomb, okay? Because it's a fullness of truth and it all comes from God, and God is a creator of all, creating us all in the image and likeness, male and female, his image and likeness. So as tough as it is, we need to look at these things, and that's what we do. We look at everything through the lens of Scripture and the teachings of the Catholic faith. It's important because this is real life, folks, and I have covered so many stories and interviewed so many people who were impacted by things, especially when I covered stories, for example, like the Oklahoma City bombing and sat right behind Timothy McVeigh when he was being arraigned in court. Horrible. And years later, I went back to Oklahoma City to speak at the Catholic Women's Conference and went to the beautiful memorial. If you have never seen it, it's powerful. And it brought back a lot of emotions for me as well in all the interviews that I did in tracing the trail of Terry Nichols and Timothy McVeigh and those connected to that horrible, horrible incident that occurred. God is love, and God is still in charge, and we look to him in all things. And that's why we do this here on Catholic Connection every day. We're going to talk about the media, and the media have a lot to do with what's going on in our culture. I know you realize that, but we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty with Tim Graham from Newsbusters in the next hour. Stay tuned.
Welcome to Catholic Connection with Teresa Tomeo, keeping you connected to your faith and your world. Teresa tackles the issues of faith and culture, the pro-life message, and media awareness. And now, here's Teresa Tomeo.
Thanks for tuning in to the second hour of Catholic Connection here on EWTN Radio Extra. Looking forward to our interview this morning. We have two segments. We probably need like 10 with Tim Graham, Executive Director and host of Newsbusters within the wonderful Media Research Center. Now, there's another number of topics that we wanted to discuss with Tim. We originally had him lined up, and he'll mention this, to talk about the cutbacks at PBS and NPR in the big, beautiful bill, losing money. It's a big story. And yet there's an even bigger story that the media are trying to suppress and ignore and trying to say that it's a distraction. And that is the news regarding allegations against the Obama administration and his inner circle regarding, basically, according to Tulsi Gabbard, inventing intel to negatively impact the 2016 election, then also, of course, the first term of then the 45th president, Donald Trump. This is a huge news story. And we see this over and over and over again with the secular media in stories that they don't want out because they are very much in line in what the left is doing. And the surveys on the media go back decades. And it's over the top. And even in the testimony that we played for you last week, which happened, earlier this year, I think it was in March or April, when they brought the heads of PBS and NPR into Washington to testify regarding the gazillions of dollars they've been getting over the years from the federal government. The head of NPR says she was not aware that every single employee in her office in D.C. was a registered Democrat. Now, you're free to have your own opinion, and reporters can vote, and they can join a political party, but it is much different when you don't have any different views in there. So that's a huge story, but the media have suppressed that as well. And there are so many other stories that are happening that the media refuse to look at in terms of the Biden administration, what happened. Of course, now they're talking out of both sides of their mouth with the Biden administration. On the one hand, they're saying that they didn't know, it wasn't that bad. And on the other hand, they're producing books about it and trying to make money, and they're blaming everybody else but themselves. They refuse to look in the mirror. There's no self-reflection going on here. And then the story about Stephen Colbert's show being canceled. Everybody and their brother, including the women on The View on ABC, are claiming this is a violation of the First Amendment. There needs to be an investigation. His agent came out this week and said the program was bleeding money. It was a financial decision. And so these are the kind of stories that you're not going to hear. Unfortunately, you should, both sides of the story. That's why it's important to know what's going on. That's why we have Tim Graham here, and that's why I'm so grateful for their work at Media Research Center and Newsbusters. In two cents, kind of ties in, I think, with what we're talking about. There's a beautiful gospel today about being open, having your eyes and your ears open, and the way the Lord tells the apostles as to why he's preaching the way he does. So we'll discuss coming up, and that will be 2 cents. That is our program for today. Okay, let's take a look at the weather, because the heat is a real issue across the country. You probably heard that. There is a big heat dome that has been extended over parts of the U.S., and we are going to see warm weather, really warm weather. I mean, obviously it's summer, but extreme heat through the end of July, according to the National Weather Service. Dangerous, long-lasting heat remains across the Mid-South to the Mid-Mississippi Valley, while heat expands into the Northeast for a brief period. Now, strong to isolated severe thunderstorms and heavy rain pose flash flooding threats from the southern high plains east to the Great Lakes. So that is the news weather-wise. But let's get started. Speaking of the news, it is a Thursday morning. You are listening to Catholic Connection, the EWTN Radio Extra Hour. Let's get started here on EWTN. While we discussed previously in the last hour, impact statements were read at the sentencing of the man who admitted to killing 4 University of Idaho college students back in 2022. Surviving roommate Dylan Mortensen was among those who spoke in court yesterday.
What happened that night changed everything. Because of him, 4 beautiful, genuine, compassionate people were taken from this world.
Brian Kohberger heard from family members of the victims, but was not required to tell the court his motive for the killings. Prosecutors say they can't force Kohberger to explain why he did it because it's not part of the plea deal. The former PhD student sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences with no ability or chance for parole. Meanwhile, the judge in the case, Stephen Hippler, said that legally, again, he could not ask Kohberger why he committed the murders. And he said, you know what? It's also not worth it.
By continuing to focus on why, we continue to give Mr. Kohberger relevance. We give him agency and we give him power.
Hippler says there will be no way to know whether he was even telling the truth. Hippler says he hopes no one works with Kohberger, meanwhile, to write a book, a movie, or give him any publicity. Kohberger admitted to the murders in a plea deal to avoid the death penalty in Idaho. In other news this morning, and we'll talk about this more with Tim Graham at the bottom of the hour, the Director of National Intelligence says there are more documents showing Obama's White House led the effort to manufacture intelligence that Russia interfered in the 2016 election. Tulsi Gabbard already passing along her ongoing investigation to the Department of Justice for a criminal referral, but adds she's unearthed troubling evidence, more troubling evidence surrounding the 2016 election.
Led by President Obama, there was an effort to create a document that would serve as a foundation for what would be a years-long coup against President Trump.
On Tuesday, the president backing Gabbard saying the intelligence community caught Obama cold. The Biden White House chief of staff is set to testify today in the GOP probe of the former president's mental fitness in office. Ron Klain previously agreeing to do a closed-door interview, but it's unknown if today he'll plead the fifth and not answer the questions. The probe has been focused on Biden's mental decline and the use of an auto pen. And authorities fear there are no survivors after a Soviet-era passenger plane carrying 49 people, including 5 children, crashed at the base of a mountain in far east Russia near the border with China today. Reporter Daria Barnachuk has more.
The crew error or a possible technical malfunction of the jet are considered as probable causes of the plane crash. Rescue operation is underway but is complicated because the debris is scattered across a densely wooded area.
The regional governor says the plane operated by Angara Air disappeared from radar as it was preparing to land. Crews were sent to the scene after the wreckage was spotted from a helicopter. Reports say the plane was built back in 1976, previously flown by the Soviet airline Aeroflot before the collapse of the Soviet Union. 3 Ohio police officers wounded yesterday afternoon in what officials are calling an ambush. 2 were sitting in their patrol car, simply eating lunch, when they were shot with a high-powered rifle.
He was laying in wait and opened fire with multiple rounds at both of the officers who were sitting in their vehicles.
That's Acting Police Chief Michael Failing. The shooting happening in Lorain, about 30 miles west of Cleveland. 2 officers shot multiple times and airlifted to a hospital. The 3rd treated for a gunshot wound to the hand. Police say the suspect was killed when officers fired back. Mark Mayfield tells us a man accused of throwing concrete bricks at federal agents in Paramount, California, now behind bars after being on the run for more than a month.
The FBI arrested Compton resident Elpidio Reyna on Wednesday morning at the U.S.-Mexico border. Investigators say he threw concrete blocks at passing ICE and Border Patrol vehicles on June the 7th, when federal immigration raids were beginning to ramp up in Los Angeles County. Several vehicles were damaged and 1 federal officer was injured. Reyna was taken back to Los Angeles to face criminal proceedings. I'm Mark Mayfield.
A Long Island man is facing federal charges for allegedly placing homemade bombs on a Manhattan rooftop and on subway tracks. 55-year-old Michael Gann of Inwood is accused of building the IEDs with materials he bought online and then storing them on a residential rooftop where this person actually lives.
In the course of 6 months, I saw him like 10 times on the roof.
Residents called police because they thought someone was living on the rooftop. Another bomb was dropped onto the tracks of the Williamsburg Bridge. None of the bombs went off. Authorities say they had 600 times, though, the force of commercial fireworks. The man was arrested back in early June. Daniel Martindale tells us the Archdiocese of Los Angeles launching a new program to help families impacted by ICE raids.
On Wednesday, Archbishop Jose Gomez announced the Family Assistance Program. It will help Archdiocese parishes provide meals, groceries, and prescription deliveries to families impacted by ICE operations. Immigration advocates say people are afraid to leave their homes and now need essential items delivered. I'm Daniel Martindale.
Pope Leo returning to the Vatican on July 22nd earlier this week around 9 o'clock in the evening local time in Rome after spending more than 2 weeks at the papal residence in nearby Castel Gandolfo. Catholic news agency confirming the Holy See press office officially confirmed his return on July 23rd. That would have been yesterday. The upon of spending a period of rest July 6th through the 22nd in the town that's about 15 miles from the Eternal City on the shores of Lake Albano. In addition to resting, the Holy Father also fulfilled several apostolic commitments. One of the most significant events, a private meeting held earlier this month with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who made a special trip to the beautiful Castel Gandolfo town to meet with the Pope. Columbia University agreeing to pay a $200 million fine over the next 3 years to resolve allegations from the Trump administration that it discriminated against Jewish students. The move will restore hundreds of millions of dollars in federal grants. Acting Columbia President Claire Shipman saying in a release, the agreement marks an important step after a period of sustained federal scrutiny and institutional uncertainty. The statement went on to say that while Columbia is not admitting to any wrongdoing, the institution's leaders have recognized that Jewish students and faculty have experienced painful, unacceptable incidents. Columbia will also pledge to follow laws banning the consideration of race in admissions and hiring. The U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee will formally prohibit men from competing in women's sports amid the Trump administration's efforts to roll back transgender policies throughout the U.S. As Catholic news agency tells us, a committee sent in an email to groups and stakeholders this week that leaders had engaged in a series of respectful and constructive conversations with federal leaders after President Donald Trump's February executive order that moved to protect opportunities for women and girls to compete in safe and unfair sports. Under the Trump administration, we will defend the proud tradition of female athletes, and we will not allow men to beat up, injure, and cheat our women and our girls. Trump said when signing the order, from now on, women's sports will be only for women. And President Trump wants America to be the world leader in artificial intelligence.
As President of the United States, I'm here today to declare that America is going to win it. We're going to work hard. We're going to win it.
He addressed a summit in Washington, D.C. yesterday, unveiling his AI action plan for the U.S. It has three main parts: accelerating innovation, building out AI infrastructure, and making American hardware and software the standard AI platform. He also wants to cut down on regulatory red tape when it comes to building energy plants to power the growing technology. It is a Thursday morning edition of Catholic Connection, and we appreciate your listenership greatly here on EWTN Radio Extra. And don't forget to watch all of our programs as well on TV, as well as listening on the radio. And, of course, Father Mitch Pacwa this evening. Weather-wise, again, be advised, extreme heat is going to hit the central U.S., and it's expanding to the east. And we're also going to have heavy rains from the southern plains to the Great Lakes. National Weather Service telling us dangerous, long-lasting heat remaining across the Mid-South to the Mid-Mississippi Valley, while heat expands into the Northeast for a brief period on Friday, and then, again, it's going to hang around for a while, so be careful out there. We'll be right back on a Thursday. You're listening to Catholic Connection on EWTN Radio Extra, a production of EWTN. We'll be right back.
"60 Seconds with Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen."
Turn over the pages of sacred scripture. What do you find? You find a record of men to whom God has spoken. And you'll also find a record of men who listened to him. In other words, scripture is fulfilled in concrete, living dialogues. Now, men do not always want that dialogue with God. At one time, they desire it. At another time, they fear it. Adam was afraid when God called him in the garden. Cain was afraid when God spoke to him. Moses was afraid before the burning bush. When you and I have a dialogue with God, what makes it up? One thing that makes it up is, first of all, a consciousness of our own sin. And the other is the voice of God urging us to confess it, to seek his mercy.
The people you know and trust are on EWTN.
Heard about a very interesting poll that was released this week through Gallup in terms of morally acceptable practices. And on the same website, they have other interesting polls regarding where people are in their faith. And some of it's okay news, a lot of it is not so good news, where people are pretty much flying by the seat of their pants and making decisions based on I don't know what. But how do you come up with any morality if you don't have a true north, a compass, right, for reality? And so that's why I wanted to take a look at not only the survey, but the gospel for today. Have you done your readings yet today? So let me just share the gospel because it ties right into this. And this is from Matthew chapter 13, verses 10 to 17. The disciples approached Jesus and said, "Why do you speak to the crowds in parables?" He said to them in reply, "Because knowledge of the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven has been granted to you, but to them it has not been granted. To anyone who has, more will be given and he will grow rich. From anyone who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because they look, but they do not see, and hear, but do not listen or understand. Isaiah's prophecy is fulfilled in them, which says, You shall indeed hear, but not understand. You shall indeed look, but never see. Gross is the heart of this people. They will hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts and be converted, and I heal them. But blessed are your eyes, because they see, and your ears, because they hear. Amen, I say to you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. The Gospel of the Lord on this Thursday, July 24th, 2025. There is so much to unpack in this Gospel and the messages from our Lord in terms of what is going on in our world and in the lives of so many. Let's just start with it on a personal basis. You shall indeed hear, but not understand. You shall look, but never see. Gross is the heart of this people. They will hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes, lest, and this is the part that really struck me this morning, lest they see with their ears, and the spot from Fulton Sheen you just heard ties into this, right? And hear with their ears and understand with their hearts, and be converted, and I heal them. Part of the reason, and we played a clip yesterday from Father Benedict Groeschel, the late great Father Benedict Groeschel. We marked his birthday yesterday, who talked about that. The reason that a lot of us, and I know this was me, and I'm not, sitting on some high horse here. I was knocked off my horse more than once. It took me a long time to come to this understanding. There's a word, ego, and I always think of it as an acronym, easing God out. We know God is there, and this is even for Christians, or even for someone who's maybe on the fence here. They technically believe in God. They see what's going on around them. They see what the church teaches. They can read it themselves. They hear it. They don't understand it. They look at it, but they don't really see it and take it in. Why? Because if they're open and they understand with their hearts, what happens? Then God starts moving in, and you're changed, and you can be healed. But only if you say yes to God, and you listen to Him. And that's a process. And this is what He's saying to the disciples, and this is why when we see what's happening in the world, and we see things that are so obvious before our eyes, and yet others just are blind to it. Well, sin and ego and pride, speaking from personal experience again, blocks you from seeing God and accepting it. And this is what our Lord is trying to tell us today. And I do believe this is what's happening so much in the world, because if you look out, and I say this from a personal perspective, as someone who went to journalism school, studied really hard, not that I was perfect, far from it, but was taught all those standards about balance and objectivity, and the reporter is not the story. And either that is not taught anymore in the J schools, or they're kidding themselves and thinking that they're doing just that. I don't understand how the media can look at what's going on, regardless of how they feel about a particular politician, and not only ignore huge stories, but work in conjunction with political operatives and members of the left in order to push particular agendas. What would that require for them to report the truth? Just to put it out there, as opposed to attacking, trying to deflect attention, ignoring the reality of the situation. They refuse, and Vanessa Denhag-Armo and I have discussed this so many times, they refuse to see what is happening to their own industry. Not only is real journalism dead, for the most part, but those who are in the business cannot see this at all. And they keep doing the same thing over and over again. What does, I think it was Einstein who said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. They don't want to listen. They hear, they see the stories, but they refuse to understand. We're going to dive into this. And Tim Graham is a very devout Catholic, the head of Newsbusters, and he's with, of course, the Media Research Center. I finally got the chance to meet him in person 2 years ago at an EWTN media conference that we had in D.C. It's so obvious how bad things are in the media. The ratings are down. They are being sued, and I know President Trump has filed several suits, but by many, many people, and they're losing. The whole situation, for example, with Stephen Colbert, it's not about some controversial thing where the Trump administration is trying to silence voices. It's not about the First Amendment. Even Colbert's agent said it's about money. The show was losing $40 million a year. The ratings were tanking. And so to sit there on their high horses on The View and these other shows and saying, this is a travesty. Look in the mirror. What's the problem? Ratings, everyone knows. Anybody who's in the media knows how important ratings are. And yet they refuse to believe it, and they have their scapegoat. And they won't hear, they won't see. Why? Because it would require them to approach their jobs differently. It would require them to reorder their thinking process. But you can't do it without God. You know, I mentioned briefly this survey that came out where people were talking about different things that are morally acceptable. They still think, well, thanks be to God, that extramarital affairs and human cloning are really bad. But they're okay with other things such as divorce, abortion, birth control. How? How do you have a view of anything without having a true north and knowing the difference between right and wrong? It takes listening, it takes seeing, it takes hearing. It takes a conversion of heart and a look in the mirror, a good long look in the mirror. And the media, which we'll discuss next, are certainly not doing that. Quite the opposite. Stay tuned. I think our gospel for today, and Jesus telling us, quoting the prophet Isaiah about seeing and not hearing, hearing and not seeing and hearing and all of that, and that we don't have our eyes and our ears open and our hearts open, is so true about what's going on, as I mentioned in the secular media in the previous segment. Someone who knows that all too well is Tim Graham, who's a fellow Catholic brother in the Lord. Finally had the opportunity to meet him in person a few years ago at a wonderful journalism conference in D.C. Tim, my goodness, so many stories. I know we're going to talk about the defunding of NPR and PBS, but I really want to talk about what's happening the last couple of days, actually since last Friday and over the weekend when Tulsi Gabbard came forward with declassified documents, so many of them, showing what those of us who have been in the media, who are trained as journalists, you and I were in the secular media for many years, certainly suspected. But now there is just ample evidence to show that they were accusing Trump and his cohorts, his workers, co-workers, and colleagues of doing exactly what they were doing. It's just such a case of projection. But now they're circling the wagons, and it is just disgusting. But I do think that hopefully it's coming out. What are your thoughts after the revelations that came out the last couple of days? Thanks for joining us.
You bet. Well, we always start with, here's a big event at the White House. The director of national intelligence comes out, makes some very bold statements about what happened after the 2016 election. And we say, well, this should be on the network evening shows. And it was not on ABC at all. It was not on NBC at all. It was not considered on All Things Considered on NPR. On CBS, it was like, let's put in a few sentences at the end of our Jeffrey Epstein obsession. We got 5 or 6 minutes on PBS last night, but that was also like, let's dismiss what this means. But for the most part, their reflexes are, if this document release is being done by Team Trump, it's not news. Mm-hmm. We had this moment yesterday where Jeff Zeleny on CNN is like, I don't think we should even be repeating this. This is what so-called news networks do. I don't think we should be covering what's going on in the White House briefing room.
Didn't they also cut from the actual live feed?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, but that's, again, this is their ideological animus, which is news is what pleases us, and what disturbs us is not news. And that's their standard, and that has been their standard for the last 10 years. And then they go, gosh, I don't know why our ratings are terrible.
Right. Well, let me play a clip from the White House press briefing yesterday. Of course, Tulsi Gabbard was there along with Caroline Leavitt, who really, I think, told the media. I mean, I think she had some really strong statements, and she made some excellent points. We've got that clip. It's about a minute long, so let's take a listen. This is Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt yesterday at the White House.
You in this room should go through it and take a look at this report and review the intelligence, because unfortunately that hasn't happened. And many of the people who perpetuated this hoax, Clapper, Andy McCabe, James Comey, and many others, have been hired by major networks in this room to go on television and continue to spew these lies, knowing that they are lies. And if you all recall, just flashback to 2016 and the years after, the entire Trump 1 presidency was embroiled in this scandal that was perpetuated by the Democrat Party. And you had major Democrat Party officials in this city, namely Adam Schiff, Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren, who went on television and told the American people Donald Trump is an asset of Russia. It was a lie. They always knew it. Hillary Clinton herself said that President Trump would be a puppet for Putin. Senator Tim Kaine at the time called President Trump Vladimir Putin's defense lawyer. Adam Schiff stated, and one of the worst things a lawmaker can do is to tell the American people, I know something you don't know, it's just classified and I can't tell you. And that's what he said. I can tell you that the case is more than that. I can't go into the particulars, but there is more than circumstantial evidence now. And not enough people in this room, not enough journalists in this country pushed Adam Schiff to say, what are you talking about? What evidence do you have? Everybody just ran with the lies, and it led to impeachments. It led to the division of our country. Unfortunately, so many Americans, from listening to outlets in this room, believed in these lies. And it's a complete scam, and it's a scandal, and the president wants to see accountability for that.
Do you think we'll ever get accountability on any level, given that these people, many of them are so manipulative, including in the media, in terms of keeping it from people? Where do we go from here? Because as you described so eloquently before that clip, Tim, the media, like CNN, breaking away from the live coverage of the White House briefing. We shouldn't be covering this, burying the story, saying it's a distraction to the Epstein case. We can get into that in a second. But are we ever going to see justice here in terms of the media actually doing their jobs?
I think we never start from the idea that they will do better. Certainly, when we write about it, our hope would be that they would do better, but I don't think we expect they would do better. That you could do better. You could do more to actually investigate what she's talking about here. Did Adam Schiff say that? Did Hillary Clinton say that? Did people call him Putin's poodle? And yes, people accuse Trump of being an actual Russian spy. And the worst part of all of it, Teresa, is that the so-called fact checkers don't do any work on this. But when President Trump said Obama was attempting a coup, pants on fire rating, as they've done before, anytime a Republican uses the word coup, they say you're lying. Now, you can turn around and say Trump is Putin's poodle, and there's no fact check. You can call Trump a fascist. There's no fact check. You can say that democracy will end under Trump, which they all say. No fact check. And so, obviously here is we have an alternative media system. That's where this goes. And I suppose you could argue that the correction in part is defunding PBS and NPR, and actually going at these, forcing networks to pay for Trump's presidential library for their lies and the way that they falsely frame things. They don't want any lawyers getting into their emails. They don't want us to read what George Stephanopoulos was saying behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the kind of accountability we're getting.
I don't think there could be any other type of accountability, because I don't think they're going to be looking in the mirror and doing any self-reflection anytime soon. They just keep digging in their heels. But I think the other accountability is going to be their own implosion. If you look at so many of the people who are now, they're just out there. There's no question, and there hasn't been a question for quite some time, but it's not as obvious to some people who don't have a media background as we do, because they go about their business and they may hear stories. Not that they don't understand it or aren't intelligent enough, but they're not looking at it from the lens that we are with our backgrounds. You look at the ABC anchor, right, who was pulled off the air because of what he said on Twitter about Trump. And then 2 days later or 3 days later, he comes out and he digs in his heels. And he says, I don't have to be. He actually said, I don't have to be balanced. He actually said that in a podcast.
Right. I mean, they don't have to be. It's not a law that you have to try to be fair and balanced.
But it's supposed to be part of ethics. That's what's still on the Society of Professional Journalists website says, is to be balanced and to give voices to all sides and to be accurate. They still keep those ethics, the code of ethics, on their various websites, and they mean nothing. It's all an act.
It's why Senator Simpson, the late Senator Simpson, used to carry around the SBJ ethics code in his coat pocket and drag it out for these people when they were rude. And this is why we are here at the Media Research Center, which is to underline when they fail to be fair and balanced, which is quite routine. But you have to get in here every day and say, what did they do? What did they not do? Who did they put on? Who did they not put on?
Right, and look at that overall. That's why we're so grateful. More with Tim Graham and the Media Research Center's Newsbusters. Check out the website, newsbusters.org. We'll be right back. So much to cover in terms of the media. We'll talk a little bit more about this also on Fact Check Friday tomorrow, a few other stories. I'm so glad we have two segments with Tim Graham from the Media Research Center's Newsbusters. It's a great website, mrc.org and newsbusters.org. You made a great point. We were chatting during the break. They cannot get over the fact that they weren't able to. And I'm just talking about what the media are saying, what they're saying amongst themselves, what you and I see as journalists. They are still in shock that Trump got reelected. They cannot believe that they were not able to keep him out of office. And they're looking at each other and scratching their heads and saying, what happened? Well, the ratings are down. Their outlets are imploding. They're losing funding. And yet they are still saying, gee whiz, I wonder what's going on. How can you not look at ratings? I mean, for crying out loud, when I worked at the ABC affiliate here in Detroit, right? I was a news anchor and reporter, and I worked for an independent station. Tim, every morning I would come in, and the EP, the executive producer, and the news director, they'll all be poring over the nightlies. And oh boy, did we hear about it if the ratings even went down slightly. It's a huge part of the business. And they're losing so many people, so many online followers. I mean, come on, circulation is down at all these newspapers that are imploding. It's not just because there's competition. That's one of the reasons. But the other big reasons is that people don't believe them anymore. Yeah,
I think there's I believe somebody recently reported the amount of revenue these late night programs are bringing in has been cut in half. That's, the economics of it have gotten very difficult. And when a Kohberger show has 200 employees, with a host making $20 million a year, you can see how that burns a hole in their pocket. The other factor in this was, my older child, my son's 35. He's like, Dad, I don't watch broadcast TV. I don't listen to broadcast radio, which is bizarre to me. But the problem here for these networks is, yes, the younger people aren't tuning in, and they know it.
So why aren't they willing to, even if they don't want to change their personal opinion, which is fine, but why aren't they willing to be what they're supposed to be, as the SBJ Code of Ethics says, at least objective and giving voice to different voices, just for their own survival? Because they're not surviving. I mean, look at CNN's ratings. And now Fox News is beating all the broadcast networks in terms of news coverage and the numbers.
And we should make the point, yes, the Gutfeld show
right.
is the real king of late night. You know, they pretend that Colbert had the best ratings, but Gutfeld, this year, Gutfeld is averaging 3.1 million viewers. Colbert has 1.9. Now, Gutfeld show is on at 10 p.m. Eastern, and Colbert's at 11:30. But, you know, there's a lot of Americans who want the other side of the road when it comes to late night comedy, and that's showing. But, you know, the liberals always pretend that they're the only people that matter. And they also love to pretend that somehow they are always nonpartisan. They don't politicize or weaponize anything.
But see, this is the whole situation. They actually believe that. So at what point, though, do you say, well, I believe that I'm being fair. I believe that I'm doing the best I can. Then why are my ratings down? Why am I in the position of losing my job or possibly losing my job? At what point, though, right?
Well, you would think, you know, but again, instead what they're going to say is they're going to blame these shows shrinking or being canceled on Trump is oppressing us, right? The First Amendment is being squashed. I mean, this is the line they're using, where Sonny Hostin comes on The View and says, this is the end of our Constitution because Stephen Colbert doesn't have a show. Like, right. Somehow there's such a thing as the First Amendment guarantees you to make $20 million a year on a late-night show.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Where's that? I don't see that in the First Amendment.
Right.
But as usual, they always think the First Amendment is only for them.
For them. Right.
So when anybody criticizes them, well, they hate the First Amendment. And we always try to tell them, the First Amendment is also us. We also have the First Amendment right to tell people that you stink.
We're talking with Tim Graham from newsbusters.org and the Media Research Center. In terms of this whole model of wokeness and everything that's happening in the media, are we starting to see, based on what you said earlier, with all these different availability, these media outlets available, different podcasts, different cable networks and whatnot, different online resources, are we starting to see the end of traditional media, do you think?
Well, I mean, on some level, this has been a trend the whole time I've been here at the Media Research Center. I mean, I started in 1989, and in the early 90s, they were saying, well, these network news operations probably won't be around in 10 years. Well, they're still here. And the reality is they are still the top people who create the narrative for what we're discussing.
Right,
so if these people all decide Epstein's going to be the Exhibit A, then that's what a lot of people end up talking about. So they still have power. They have a much smaller audience than they had 30 years ago. But they still have this sort of narrative dominance. It's just, as we've discussed, so many fewer Americans are paying attention. And it answers the question as to why the Republicans can still win in an atmosphere in which these people are so relentlessly hostile.
You would think that would be some discussions in the newsroom, so in terms of the results of the election. That's the amazing thing, because I can remember we would have these meetings, every few weeks with our news director, and when I was in the secular media, both in radio and TV, and we'd sit around and talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how we did. Is that even happening, do you think?
Well, see, I always go back to Uri Berliner's story that he wrote last year for the Free Press on NPR, and he was basically like, I would try to bring these concerns.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they would all smile politely and then go back and do the same thing. Nothing ever happened. And I think the definitive thing for him was October 7.
Right.
And that nothing changed, that NPR has been a relentless, whatever the Gaza Health Ministry says is the gospel. And Israel is always the enemy. And that, I think, is what drove him out. But I think they're remarkably unreceptive and unreflective of anything they're doing wrong when it comes to bias, because they're so self-righteous about it's their job to destroy Trump and the Republicans. They think that's what the objective is.
Right. Well, they've lost sight of what journalism is, because that's not journalism. That becomes advocacy and activism, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's basic journalism is not hard, which is like you would have said, we did a story, the director of national intelligence was in the briefing room. She said this. Then we went to Adam Schiff, and he said she's full of beans. And you just report both sides. It's not hard. It's not It's not difficult. They're just incapable of doing that because they're like, no, we don't want to platform the people that actually got elected to the White House.
Right. And so, yeah, if you're truly doing your job, put them both out there, and fine, cover the Epstein story, but don't treat it as claiming that this is just a, this whole thing with Tulsi is a distraction. Did you notice how the Wall Street Journal came out with a story, and this was shortly after that they were sued by Trump because of the letter they published, what Trump says is a fake, the birthday letter, the Epstein birthday letter, supposedly. And they come out with a story about how Trump is mentioned in the Epstein documents. Okay. So are dozens and dozens of other people. And they buried the lead because it actually said later on in the story that it was other names mentioned, hearsay, in the middle of hearsay. So there was nothing definitive. It was just a bunch of names that were mentioned. And okay, fine, cover it, because the president that is a story. I agree. But to sit there and say that all of these declassified documents that exist, is a distraction to Epstein. Now, the other question I have for people who think that there's something to the Epstein story, and this is something that should come up, and I know as a journalist, I'm sure you're thinking the same thing. You and I both know, Tim, that if there were a really strong connection between Epstein and Trump, that it would have been all over the news and it would have been pummeled in our faces constantly for the last several years when all this Epstein stuff first started to surface.
Well, I think it could have been a big story in 2015 and 2016, but, there was always a real problem with that, and that is Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton flew multiple times on Epstein Island. They've got pictures of Bill Clinton with Epstein, pictures of Bill Clinton with young ladies. This is why they've sort of been engaged in sort of a weird truce on Epstein. That is absolutely a story, but the way they're using it right now, your framing is exactly right. The way that they do this, where they say, your concerns are a distraction. The real news is whatever we like. And what we like is anything that tears the Republicans in two. That's news. Your attempt to put shade on the Democrats, that's not news because we are Democrats.
Right. Well, Catholics need to be concerned about this because Archbishop Shapiro, I always quote him, he says we need to know how the media works so they don't work on us, because we have a responsibility as voters to be aware. And if we aren't getting accurate information, it's going to impact how we vote. And that's why I'm so grateful for, he's not Catholic, he's Jewish, but Uri Berliner, the one you just mentioned, former senior editor at NPR, did a great piece on thefreepress.com. It was actually even reposted on Catholic Vote. Whistleblower reacts to public media defunding. And the article was called Happy Independence Day, NPR. And he was talking about the fact that because of the big, beautiful bill, they're removing $1.1 billion in federal support for NPR, PBS, and other public media outlets. And to me, this is huge because, again, like the other secular media, PBS was nothing and NPR, nothing, unfortunately, but a platform for the left. And what really is disappointing for me, I started my career in radio. And I used to love listening to NPR because they were so great with natural sound and editing, and they were so creative. But then it just turned into, again, nothing but nasty politics against anyone, even slightly to the right. Do you think NPR is getting a message now? Or, again, are they clutching their pearls and saying, oh, we're being suppressed by the Trump administration?
Again, I have no expectation that they're going to improve. They knew once Trump and the Republicans were elected last year that they were in funding trouble, and they didn't change one whit, right? They had this whole Uri Berliner problem, and they responded by doing exactly the same thing. And Catherine Marr, the CEO of NPR, ridiculously goes everywhere and says she hasn't seen any bias on her network, which suggests she's never listened to it, ever. But what Uri Berliner says in this new piece is Catherine Morrow say, "Oh, I'd love to talk about this with people." And he said, she had the chance to talk to me and she never took it. And that, again, shows you they are not responsive to criticism.
And early Berliner is not conservative at all. He's very left-leaning. He admits that. He admitted that early on. He did not vote for Trump. He always votes Democratic. And he comes from a very liberal family from California. But as a reporter, he saw how bad it was. He says in this article, it's a self-inflicted wound, a product of how NPR embraced a fringe progressivism that cost it any legitimate claim to stand as an impartial provider of news, much less one deserving of government support. Bingo.
Well, and one of the studies we did on PBS, just to give you an example, showed the NewsHour's remarkable advocacy for the transgender lobby, that almost everyone that they interviewed on that subject was a transgender activist, and that all the questions were favoring them. And the only moment where a guest on PBS said something opposite was lesbian tennis icon Billie Jean King saying that she didn't believe that men should be in women's sports on an adult level.
So that was their idea of balance. Yeah.
They didn't ask her. It just popped out. That was how opposition comes.
So one last question before we let you go, and I always ask this for our guests. So what can we as Catholics do, concerned about the information that's being put out there and how it impacts us and fellow Catholics, our children, grandchildren? What do you think, real quick?
Everybody needs to understand that these so-called mainstream media outlets are hostile to traditional religious values. That's where it starts. So you might want to not make sure that you don't consume too much of it. Come read us instead.
Amen. And listen to us too. Thanks, Tim. God bless you. Appreciate your great work. Tim Graham, a fellow Catholic, and he's with Newsbusters and MRC. We'll be right back. Thanks so much for tuning in to Catholic Connection. We have a number of great interviews coming up tomorrow, including our very own Doug Heck, and we're also going to be looking at evangelization through digital media. Do want to remind you that my friend Raymond Arroyo, whom I call Raimondo, is part Italian. He always reminds me of that. And he is. He's a fellow Italian. The world over tonight. Chris Bedford, senior political editor at The Blaze, talking about the rise of socialist mayoral candidates in major cities and the latest in U.S. political news. Gordon Chang, China and U.S. foreign policy expert, will be joining Raymond with the latest on U.S. trade strategy in Asia and also looking at Chinese espionage. And Jim Jordan, U.S. Congressman from Ohio, discussing a recent House Judiciary Committee revealing more details about the FBI spying on traditional Catholics. That is a huge story. CNA, Catholic News Agency, had a story on this yesterday. It's chilling. Remember when the previous administration said, it was just an outlier. It was just one little office in Virginia. It's no big deal. Stop clutching your pearls. Well, it turns out everybody knew about it. Shocker, including the FBI headquarters. So, very important discussion. And Melissa Giller of the Reagan Foundation and Library shares the amazing Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition currently being shown at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. So what a great lineup Raymond has. Looking forward to talking to you tomorrow, God willing. Have a great Thursday. It's going to be Friday tomorrow. Thanks be to God. And hopefully we'll all have a good weekend. Talk to you tomorrow, though, first. Ciao, ciao.